Is it okay to ask questions about God, faith, truth, meaning? Is it okay to even have questions like that? We all have questions. What do I do with doubt? What do I do with the Bible? What do I do with suffering? Is God really there? Lucky for us, God is not threatened by our questions. He welcomes them and wants to meet us in moments of uncertainty. So let your curiosity lead you into deeper conversation with God.
Well, good morning, IBC. My name is Andrew McQuitty. I am the IBC pastor at large, and it's my privilege today to take the second in our new sermon series at IBC, which we've called Blessed Are the Curious. It's a sermon series in which we're asking some hard questions of faith in the belief that in the asking of them and in the grappling with them, that we will actually deepen our faith. This morning, the question that we're asking, and hopefully I'm answering, is if God is real, why is he so quiet? I wonder if you've ever had that question. That's actually a very philosophical, somewhat intellectual, somewhat diplomatic formulation of a question that God's people have been asking for centuries. It's a question that comes out of the frustration that often we have when we're going through periods of trouble and chaos and don't sense the presence of God, don't hear the voice of God. There is, in the Bible, in the Psalms, King David actually formulates this question differently in a far more confrontive and I think emotionally honest way, the way I like it. What do you think? Psalm 10:1, why, Lord, David asks, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? Notice the third person philosophical question, if God is real, has become a very first person confrontational question. Why, Lord, do you stand far off? Notice that David confronts God and basically laments to God that you're not showing up when I need you. Why are you absent in my times of trouble? Now, which one of those formulations of the question do you like best? Which one would you like answered most? I think David's formulation is the best. It is brash, it is confrontive, but it's honest. And it expresses the feelings of all of us from time to time when we go through troubled times and sense the seeming absence and silence of God. So I'm going to answer David's question this morning, David's formulation of the question. And I want to give two biblical reasons starting out for God's sometimes silence in troubled times. Two reasons for God's sometimes silence in troubled time. The first reason is simply this. Sometimes God's not silent. We just make too much noise to hear him. Sometimes he's not silent. We're just too noisy to hear him. When I was in college, I read a book by the great Francis Schaeffer, the great late Francis Schaeffer. It was a book entitled, He is There and He is Not Silent. And I've never forgotten that, because it reflects the truth of the Bible, that God is never absent and he is rarely silent. You go through the Bible, go through the Old Testament, Psalm 139. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I go to get away from you, where you are absent from my life, David asks? Where can I flee from your presence? It's a rhetorical question there in Psalm 139, which demands a nowhere answer. Nowhere can I go to be away from you. You are always present with me everywhere. And as for God speaking, Psalm 19:1 declares that our ever-present yet invisible God is always speaking. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hand. Day after day pours forth speech. God is never absent. He is rarely silent. Jesus promised us his brothers and sisters, whenever he ascended into heaven, he says, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. You may sometimes sense my seeming absence, but I'm with you. And the Spirit that Jesus sent, the Spirit of Christ, in Romans 8:16 says that the Spirit himself continues to testify with our spirit, to communicate with our spirit, to speak into our spirit that we are God's children. So in the scriptures, we see very clearly that, yes, God is invisible, but he is also ever present and rarely quiet. Now, here's the kicker. We have to be quiet to experience him. We have to stop making so much noise that we can't hear him. You remember where God told us this, Psalm 46:10, be still and know I'm God. You will know I am God. You will know that I'm with you. You will know that I'm communicating with you if you're still, if you're quiet. Now let me ask all of you a question, and I want you to answer it honestly to yourself or to anybody else who's around you. When you enter a season of trouble in your life, when things aren't going well, and you've been praying, you've been talking to God and asking him to bail you out, and he's not answering that prayer, let me ask you, when you're going through a time of trouble as a child of God, do you get quieter in your spirit or louder in your spirit? I will tell you right off the bat, I get loud. I get frustrated. I get agitated. I get combative. I get hyperactive. I get upset. I get whiny. Because I start talking and fuming and making noise in my spirit to the point that God's still small voice gets drowned out. Great example of this in my life is several years ago when I was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. And I went through several days, even maybe a couple of weeks after that diagnosis, of just being so frustrated, so upset, so loud, so combative with God that I couldn't hear him. I couldn't sense him. He seemed absent from me. He seemed silent to me. And I actually wrote some of the thoughts that I had in the book, Notes from the Valley, coming out of that experience that will expose to all of you my noisiness whenever I entered into that valley of trouble. I wrote these words: I admit now that my initial why me God query was not actually a real question. No, I was actually cross-examining God. Okay, honestly, I was lambasting God. For the nature of the inquiry was not honest asking, but angry accusing. I was not truly seeking information when I bellowed, why me? I was actually indicting God for dereliction of duty, as in, Lord, this is me suffering down here. Hello? It appears you have fallen down on the job. And I want you to know I don't like it one little bit, and I wish you would get with the program and do your duty and get me out of this jam. ASAP. I'm not proud of that response. And I had that response for quite a while at the front end of my cancer journey. It just seemed like God was far off. It just seemed like he was silent in my time of trouble. But I've come to see, I even came to see then, that God wasn't silent. He wasn't absent. Rather, I was just too noisy to hear his voice. So what are a couple of biblical reasons for the seeming absence and silence of God in our times of trouble? The first one is sometimes he's not silent, we're just too noisy. The second answer is sometimes God does temporarily go silent to deepen our faith, If you, like me, have been in a time of trouble and got really loud and noisy, you understand how difficult it is to quiet down and to hear the voice of God. You also recognize the necessity of quieting down and expressing your heart to God, but then listening for his answer. In other words, to join the great company of men and women in the Old and New Testaments who all asked this question. And as a result of grappling with this question in their life, God deepened their faith and then used them in a powerful way in the world. I think of King David, a man after God's own heart. He's the one that formulated the question this morning in Psalm 10. But he asked this question all through the Psalms and in many laments. He was a man after God's own heart who went through many seasons of trouble. And he asked this question. Righteous Job asked it. Fleeing Jonah asked it. Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, asked it. Elijah asked it when he was having his chaos with Jezebel. John the Baptizer, according to Jesus, the greatest man who ever lived, asked the question from Herod's prison. All of these great ones, and many more in Scripture, asked this question, where are you, Lord? And as a result of grappling with that question, they grew deeper in their faith and were blessed by God in their ministry. Many years ago, famous psychologist William James, Harvard professor, wrote a vintage book that is famous in 1902 called The Varieties of Religious Experience. And in this book, Dr. James pointed out that a disproportionate number of spiritual experiences, life-changing spiritual experiences, happen to, and I quote, prisoners, hospital patients, the involuntarily unemployed, and others whose activities and prospects have been temporarily constrained. In other words, the disproportionate number of deep spiritual and transforming spiritual experiences happen to people in times of trouble. In times of trouble. I conclude this. All of God's children are inevitably schooled in the desert of God's silence, because sometimes the best learning is done on our own. Now, this is not my favorite truth. I wish I had God with me, like training wheels holding me up every step of the way, and I never had to take those training wheels off. But God says no. Sometimes the best learning is done without leaning on me. The best learning is done alone. You remember when you were a kid and your parents were helping you with your math homework at the kitchen table? I do. My dad, he's an Irishman, not that great a whiz in math, but he was helping me. And he showed me how to work this problem. And then he said, now you work it. You work the rest of your homework, and I'm going in the other room. I'm done. And I said, Dad, no, I want you to stay here. I want you to help me do this. He says, no. He says, I'm helping you learn this. But I'm helping you by not helping you. Because by not helping you, you're gonna have to help yourself. You're gonna have to learn this on your own if you're ever gonna own it for yourself. And that's what God says to us. I'm always with you. But sometimes you have to learn this by grappling on your own with these questions of faith. And you will come to some revelations and some truths and some principles in your life on your own that you could never get if you were leaning on me the whole way. God's promise while we're doing our math homework alone is that He's not going to be there vociferously and vocally helping us, but He's never going to leave us. He's never going to leave us. Certain American Indian tribes I read about, their young braves, when they turned 13, had one final proof of their manhood that they had to pass in order to be accepted as a man into the tribe. And that was when they were 13 years old. They were blindfolded. They were led deep into the forest at night and left alone with nothing but the wild animals as their companions. It was a terrifying experience for these young men. But when the dawn broke, they were inevitably astonished to look up and to see not too far away their father. He'd stood guard over him, bow and arrow, all night long. He never left. He was there, but they had to do it alone. Whether you realize it or not, my friends, God is doing the same thing for you and for me, even in his intentional periods of silence in our life. He's with us. He's standing watch over us. He's caring for us, even as we learn on our own lessons that can only be learned on our own. J.I. Packer, a great professor and writer, who I had the privilege of meeting and knowing personally. He wrote a book called Knowing God many years ago, in which he expressed this care and presence of God in our lives. Dr. Packer says, what matters supremely is not that I know God, but the larger fact which underlies it, the fact that he knows me. I am graven on the palms of his hands. I am never out of his mind. He knows me as a friend, and there is no moment when his eye is off me or his attention distracted from me, and no moment, therefore, when his care falters. Never, ever. So, how should we apply this? How should we answer the question, how do I hold on to God when it feels like he's let go of me? And that's really the import of David's question there in Psalm 10:1. That's really the cry of our hearts whenever we're going through times of trouble and we sense the seeming absence and silence of God. How do we hold on to him? There are two things I want to suggest to you. The first is this: practice being still so that you can hear his voice. You got to practice it. In our daily devos at IBC here through the whole coronavirus shutdown, we've been going through various books of the Bible. In our teaching team here at IBC, we went through several books. One of them that we just finished was Genesis. And in Genesis, we had that great story in Genesis chapter 28, where Jacob has just stolen his brother's birthright and lied to his father, and he's on the lam now going up to his uncle Laban in Haran. And he's in Genesis 28 alone in the desert with a rock for his pillow, and it says this is what happened. Jacob left Beersheba, stopped for the night. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. When Jacob awoke, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. He said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. I think probably that was the first time in Jacob's whole life that he quieted down enough to hear God's voice and to sense his presence. And I think that's the key for us, is we've got to quiet down enough to sense God's presence and develop an increased capacity in our life to hear his voice. See, that's something that you have to practice at that. You have to practice at getting quiet. You have to practice at the presence of God. Brother Lawrence famously wrote in his book, The Practice of the Presence of God, these words: the most holy and necessary practice in our spiritual life is the presence of God. That means finding constant pleasure in his divine company, speaking humbly and lovingly with him at all seasons, at every moment, without limiting the conversation in any way. You got to practice that. You got to practice that. During the shutdown, I decided I had extra time on my hands, and I was going to learn how to play the guitar. So I went online, and I hooked myself up with some online guitar lessons. And I thought, this is just going to be a hoot. This is just going to be fun. And at first, it was because it was easy, but it very quickly got very difficult, very trying, very hard. I mean, I'm 64, almost 65 years old, and some of those chords that they were telling me to do, I just couldn't do. I could not do it. Could not do it. So how did I learn to do it? Practice. Practice, practice, practice. It takes practice to develop a capacity for experiencing that for which you are seeking. We have to practice being in the presence of God. We have to practice quieting down. So back to my whole Cancer Valley experience. The first couple of weeks, man, I was loud and noisy. But I began to realize, this isn't getting me anywhere. I need to quiet down. I need to listen to God. I need to practice His presence. And so instead of fuming and being combative and asking questions and challenging God, I started just spending more and more time in Scripture, just reading and asking the Lord, pour into my quieted soul your truth. Help me to understand that you are here and that your voice is everywhere. And He did. He did. I spent a lot of time in the Word and in prayer. I spent a lot of time sitting and thinking. I spent a lot of time on my back porch just sitting. But it was quiet time, and it was productive. So, practice being still so that you can hear His voice. The second suggestion I have for you, if you are this morning in a time of trouble and sensing the seeming absence and silence of God in your life, I want you to practice being still so that you can hear His voice. And the second thing is, I want you to joyfully focus on the lessons that God is teaching you in the present moment. In the present moment. I love David's Psalm 118:24. He says, "This is the day the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it." And when a lot of people hear that verse, they think, this is the day in which we're supposed to rejoice, so this must be a really wonderful day. No, there's no indication of what kind of day it is. It just says, this is the day. It could be a sorry day. It could be a difficult, it could be a heartbreaking day. But notice what God says. Whatever the day is, you focus in the present. You don't live in the past, it's gone. You can't live in the future because it's not here yet. The only time when you can be fully alive and fully present is in the now. This is the day. And if it's a troubled day, whatever, this is the day. Rejoice and be glad in it. When I began to do that, I began to say to the Lord, so many things I'm learning that I had never known before. When I started into my chemotherapy for 2 years, those were painful and difficult times. But I began to use those chemotherapy sessions as opportunities to write in my journal the things that God was teaching me. I have in my journal one day in the chemo lounge, I wrote these words. I said, this is what I've learned. I am weak. Jesus is strong. Love is precious. And I began to write other things. I began to write a whole bunch of stuff. And all that other stuff that I wrote, learnings, focusing on the lessons that God was teaching me, became a book, Notes from the Valley. It tells the story of all that God taught me and did in me as I was being quiet and practicing His presence. I actually wrote about that in the book in these words. When I entered the valley of cancer, my focus was initially on my cancer. And that's when I was loud and obstreperous and unpleasant to be around, especially for God. My focus was initially on my cancer, but God graciously refocused me on my faith. What he's doing, where he's taking me, what I'm learning. Delightfully, I discovered that faith in God is not merely a doughy, pietistic exercise in futility, but rather the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. I discovered that the gospel for which I had believed and worked and sacrificed actually became more, not less real in the valley. I discovered that God shows up in this place like no place else. It removes the veil from my eyes, giving sight to my faith and definitively proving that he is a very present help in times of trouble. So why? Why sometimes God's seeming silence in our life? That's the question King David raised for us. Two answers: sometimes God's not silent, we're just too loud. And the second possible answer is sometimes God is silent temporarily to deepen our faith. I pray that if you are in a time of trouble now, and I dare say probably many are, in these times of chaos and fear and uproar in our world and in our culture, I would say to you, if you are feeling the seeming absence and silence of God in your life and it's troubling you, please practice. Practice being still so that you can hear his voice and joyfully focus on the lessons that God is teaching you in the present moment. I believe if you do this, you will experience his presence. You will hear his voice, and you will be blessed beyond measure.